Hello, everyone, to the Obligations of Memory podcast. This is our second part of our interview with Peter Kupfer, a noted author, and he has written The Glassmaker's Son. We're going to start today, and let me give you a brief background on Peter. Peter is a writer, editor, and photographer based in San Francisco. His articles on arts and culture, business and technology, travel, and other subjects have appeared in leading newspapers, magazines, and websites, including the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Observer, and the Metropolis magazine. So welcome to our second part of our interview, Peter. I'm glad that we could now talk about your book. And we're going to really start this interview by going to the end. You're publishing your book. It's coming out on November 22nd. And why don't we talk a little bit about how you came about having it published? Where is it being published? The good challenges, the successes, and perhaps some of the things that you've learned along the way.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Yeah, it's been a long process. As a first-time author, I didn't know very much about the publishing industry and how it worked. So I took a couple of workshops and how to find an agent, how to write a query letter and that sort of thing. And I spent well over a year, trying to find an agent without any luck. Had a few close calls. One agent actually was agreed to represent me. He sent me a contract, and between the time I received the contract and the time I signed it and returned it, he had changed his mind. So that do were some other disappointments, but it's just a question of persistence.
Do you think you need an agent to write a book?
Well, I was told that I did, and I was told that if you don't have an agent, that the publishers won't even look at your manuscript. So it was a waste of time to just send, to try to find a publisher without one. So that's what I did for the first year. But then after all the frustrations, I decided, okay, well, I've got nothing to lose. So I did actually start approaching publishers directly. And, fortunately for me, I found one who actually specializes in the subject matter, which is, Holocaust memoirs. So I found this publisher called Amsterdam Publishers, which is run by a woman in the Netherlands, obviously. And she was quite receptive to the idea of the book, but she was not initially open to additional queries. So she suggested I send the manuscript again in May of this year. So on May 1st at 12:01 a.m., I think, because I was so eager to have her read my manuscript, I sent it to her, and within hours she responded. And after all these years of frustration and heartache, she said yes.
Wow. So what was the celebration that you went? What did you do to celebrate?
My partner and I think we had some champagne, which is quite convenient because he's in the wine industry.
Good for you.
So, yeah.
Okay, so we see that the lesson is we probably don't need an agent, and going direct doesn't hurt you. Is there any other tips for our audience who are either we have plenty of published authors, but there are many people who are writing and want to write their family memoirs and want to figure out how to get published. So are there any other tips that you may have?
I think one thing that was pointed out to me that I thought was quite instructive was in my query letter, this person said, you make it clear why you wanted to write the book. But what you didn't make as clear is why would someone want to read the book that you wrote? So I think always keep in mind, because obviously publishers are in business to make a living, and they need to sell books. So it's all well and good to express why you felt compelled to write the book, which I did, but I didn't really make a strong enough case for why someone would want to read a book.
So tell me, what was the reason why I should read your book? What was your, when you got down to writing, what did you tell that person in the Netherlands?
Well, the thing is, obviously Holocaust memoirs are legion. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of them. So you have to, I don't want to sound, crass or venal, but you have to show why your story might be distinctive, why someone would want to read your story as opposed to, or in addition to all these other stories. So, you try to focus on what is distinctive about your story.
And which is? Go ahead.
In my case, the fact that my father lived this quite affluent, to me anyway, to a middle-class kid growing up in Connecticut, seemed very, exotic and glamorous. He had these fancy cars and these beautiful resorts that they went to. And so that was one element. It was just, this whole glamorous seeming life that I wanted to, convey. And also, my experiences going back to his hometown and learning that his family had been in the glass industry and had been, successful industrialists, and my discovering all this stuff because my dad never spoke about it. And then there was also another interesting element that I mentioned in my proposal, and that was that after my first visit to my father's hometown, I got a letter from his former housekeeper, who was now in her 90s and blind. And she had been entrusted with 2 portraits of my great-grandparents. So my grandfather, before he was forced to sell his house under the Nazi policies, had given his housekeeper these 2 paintings of my great-grandparents that he never mentioned anything about this, and I had no idea they existed. So that was a whole chapter in my book about the process of going back to his hometown and trying to reclaim these paintings, which I should mention took the better part of 30 years to achieve.
Wow, that could be another book. That's book 2.
Well, it's a chapter, but I don't know about a book, but anyway, yeah.
So, okay, we're going to go back to the ideation part of book writing. So how did you, in a sense, decide this is not your normal way you chose a profession? You're a reporter and an interviewer and a writer on nothing Holocaust in your bio. So what was the ideation that got you motivated to start to think about a book about your father?
Well, I think first of all, I was just generally curious about my dad's life and the fact that he very rarely spoke about his early years. And so I knew very little about his life growing up in Germany. The one thing that he had brought, because they weren't allowed, he wasn't able to take a lot of things with him when he immigrated, but he did bring along a photo album, and that album had all these photographs of his family, and their homes and their travels. And so I was very curious to learn more about it. So that was one of the motivations for wanting to write the book, to go back and uncover more things about his years. And I also discovered a box of old documents shortly after my father died in my parents' attic. And that contained correspondence between my father and his grandfather attempting to negotiate a way of getting him out of Germany. The correspondence was in the early, around 1941. And it was all these letters between them in which my grandfather was discussing, the fact that they had no money, they'd lost their home, they were forced to move to Frankfurt, and live in several different houses. They were actually evicted from a couple of residences, and so it was all the the trauma and struggle that they endured before my grandfather was deported to Theresienstadt. So that also sparked my interest, and I, to make a long story short, a few years after Dad died, I went to Germany, to Europe for the first time, and I visited his hometown. And in the course of that visit, I made a number of really, to me, quite, interesting discoveries. I found out that the factory that my grandfather had owned was going out of business the very day that I arrived in his hometown. And I was interviewed by, in the course of trying to find my grandfather's old house, I stumbled upon the office of the local newspaper, and I was interviewed by one of the reporters there, and she wrote a series of stories about my visit, because it was, to them, it was a small town, and they were quite interested in learning about this son of a former resident whose family was quite prominent in the town. So it's a series of different events that led me to write the book.
Okay, so let's talk about your research. How long was your research? What did you have a process around building the research? You're in a sense talking about historical research as that needs to be buttoned up.
Yeah, initially it was just sort of curiosity and sort of casual, personal history that I was accumulating without, realizing or not knowing that I was going to write a book at that point. But about 10 years ago, with the encouragement of one of my colleagues at the San Francisco Chronicle, where I worked, who was actually a publisher herself, and she thought it would be an interesting book. So that's when I started getting serious about doing more research. And fortunately for me, one of my cousins in England, was involved with the Wiener Holocaust Library. So he had access to a lot of research and was very, very skilled at how to research Holocaust-related.
Where is that museum? Where is that?
In London.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a very, I believe it's maybe outside of Yad Vashem in Israel, the largest repository of Holocaust documents in the world.
Can you access it virtually, or you have to go there?
I think you can access it virtually. I got most of my research through my cousin, but I'm sure that they have a portal. It's the Wiener Library, Wiener.
Can you spell that for us?
I believe it's Wiener.
All right, thanks.
Wiener or Wiener.
Right, and so your research started 10 years. Then you, at what point do you start to realize that you have a book? How are you going to structure the outline of the book? Do you, for instance, I'd love to kind of tie in your process. Do you come up with chapters? How do you build what is eventually a 250 some page book?
Yeah, it was a complicated process, because it was actually two stories that I was writing. I was writing the story about my father's family, but I was also writing a story about my relationship with my father, because that was an important part to me of what I wanted to write. So, I love my dad very much, and I always yearned to get closer to him, but I always felt like I was at a distance from him. So I was writing both about his history that I didn't know firsthand, but also about my own personal history growing up with him, and with this kind of enigmatic man who I loved but didn't really know a lot about. So,
can you share a story down that path about the love of your father?
Well, he used to travel a bit for business. And so part of the book, I would, when I was very young, even like 8 years old, maybe this is why I decided to become a writer, but I was already sort of writing him little notes and postcards. And when he was on the road, so part of the book includes some of the little notes I wrote to him, and in the notes he wrote me back.
Who saved them? Who saved them? You're a little kid, you said.
Just found them in some old boxes in my mother's attic. Yeah.
So your mom saved them?
Yeah, she saved quite a bit. Yeah. So there's part of that, and then I recount some of the stories growing up. He used to take us into New York to go to the show, to go to Broadway maybe once or twice a year. We grew up in New Haven. So I recount some of the joy I felt about going to New York with my dad and going to Horn and Hard Art, to the automat,
Yes.
and how amazed I was to see this food appear in the window, and just things like that. And then going to see Fiddler on the Roof with my family, and dad, singing. We were all singing the songs from the show in the car on the drive back to Connecticut. Just things like that kids remember.
So coming back to the structure and process, how did you develop a process for Peter's Glassmaker's Sons book?
Well, it was just a lot of, at first I wrote sort of the stories like as two different books almost, the story of the history of my family, my father's family, and then the story of my relationship with my dad. But then as it evolved, I started sort of interspersing segments of each, and going back and forth. And I should also mention, I went to my father's hometown 5 times. So there was all this information, but I discovered that to keep the readers engaged, it was probably better, instead of just separating into 2 halves, was to sort of interlace them. So as the book evolved, it starts out actually, and this was one of the suggestions that one of the editors I hired, because I did hire an editor in New York to review the manuscript. And she suggested, I originally started out with my growing up with my dad, but she thought the most essential focus of the book should be my quest to uncover the life he left behind, the world he left behind in Nazi Germany. So that's how I opened the book, with him immigrating to the United States, on the ship he sailed out of France to New York, and arriving in New Haven, Connecticut, where his sponsor lived. And so I started it out. Oh no, excuse me. I didn't start it. That's how I started out with one draft, but the final draft is actually my first trip to his hometown, and my discovering the newspaper, and they're writing an article about me, my learning that the factory my family had owned was closing, was going out of business that very day, and that sort of thing.
So did your father, when he came by ship, did he go through Ellis Island, or how did he come in?
No, he didn't go through Ellis Island. I don't believe. But I actually never really found out the whole story of that. But I believe he just arrived, at the port in New York.
Okay. And so again, coming back, your process is that you're integrating your 2 books. So how are you reconciling this out in your head, and how did you finalize that reconciliation?
Well, I just think that I had to keep in mind that I think the driving theme of the book was my quest to learn more about my father. So by, sort of interlacing the stuff from Germany with chapters of my life with him that sort of revealed his character, because there was a lot of a lot of other material that came out that I had to discard because it, as my editor suggested, it wasn't really germane to my relationship with dad. I talked about my mother's family a lot and I also, being, I don't know if I mentioned this, but as a gay man, I talked a lot about my own experiences growing up and coming out in New York. I lived in New York City, and some of that story might be interesting, but it wasn't really necessarily germane to the quest for my father. So I had to sort of focus the book on my father and my relationship with him and discard a lot of material that wasn't directly germane.
So do you know how many pages of total writing that you did to get down to 250?
I would say it was probably closer to 350 or 400.
Wow.
So a lot of chapters got thrown away.
Obviously, you still have those pages. Do you go back and look at those pages now that you've completed and reminisce over the cutting of the pages on the floor?
I don't know if I reminisce, but I certainly mourn. Yeah, there was some good writing, and as my editor said, some of that, just because it didn't make it into this book doesn't mean it's not, not suitable for publication in another venue. So yeah, we'll see. Actually, some of the story, there's one chapter I wrote, I won't go into much detail, but it was, a very kind of foundational experience for me in New York, as a gay man. And, a lot of people thought it was really an amazing story, but it just didn't belong in the book. So I've actually had it published in a gay journal. So that sort of thing.
Okay, so you, the part that I would like to now get out is, what did you learn about the editing and the research and the process part that you could share tips, shortcuts with our audience?
Well, I would say that persistence is the most important keyword to any aspiring author. You really have to, don't put all your eggs in one basket. You have to really be ferocious in trying to, first of all, get an agent. And then if that fails, try to go directly to the publisher. I still think, even though I didn't actually have an agent and eventually found a publisher on my own, I do think that if you can, you should try to get an agent initially. And one way of doing that is, there's a website, I wish I had it handy, but there are websites that have engines where you can focus your search to the specific genre that you're working with. In my case, it was memoir. So, there are hundreds and hundreds of agents, maybe thousands. And this way, if you put in, for instance, memoir, that will, filter out only those agents that focus, specialize in memoir. You can specialize, gay, lesbian content. So there are many ways you can filter out, and that's one way of trying to, tailor your prospective search for an agent.
So you mentioned you have family in London. That's part of your father's side. You disclosed that you're gay and you have a partner. So yes. Obviously writing, and it sounds like you've been writing for 10 years, so it's a big part of your life. What does the family say along the way? Obviously your partner has given up a significant amount of you in order for you to be able to achieve what you wanted to write this book. So talk to us a little about what your family had to say about writing.
Well, yeah, first of all, my dad, obviously died many years ago. My mom died about 15 years ago. And my only sibling, my brother, Richard, who was a year and a half older. Unfortunately, he passed away about 10 years ago. So I don't really have that many people in my family. I am close to my brother's two daughters, one of whom has been very encouraging to me about writing the book. And, my partner, who, by the way, has a German ancestry. His father was German and his mother is Venezuelan. Yeah, I mean, he wasn't always happy about the time I devoted to the book. And, he was supportive of the idea, but I have to say that we've had a few disputes and conflicts because even as recently as last night, because I'm actually was working on the final draft of the book, and we were trying to watch a movie, and I had to excuse myself because I had to get in the final revisions by midnight tonight. I was working on it, or I should say midnight last night. So yeah, I mean, it's challenging, and you really have to be, devoted to the project.
Now, you also have your father's brothers in England, right? And they're
not brother. My father's brother immigrated to France, and so yes, I do have some cousins there.
Do they know?
Yeah, and I also have a cousin in England who, the one I mentioned, who's involved with the Wiener Library.
And do they approve of what you've done?
Yeah, it's, I just discovered that I was going to get a publisher just within the last few weeks, but they're very excited. And I have to say, my cousin in England, Paul, without his help, this book never could have happened, because another thing I didn't mention is that I don't speak German. My cousin in England is fluent in German, and he was instrumental, as was a German-American friend here in San Francisco area, who helped translate a lot of these documents. So without their help, I would never have been able to have written this book.
Does Waldemar, your partner, speak German?
Actually, he doesn't speak German, because his father, although his father was German, he left the family when Waldemar was very young. He's fluent in Spanish, though.
That's very good. Well, I want to give you some opportunity. We're talking about the glassmaker's son. How would you want the audience to remember this interview? Why do you want them to go out, and eventually the book will be on Amazon? Why do you want them to buy it?
Well, I just think that, like many other stories, the Holocaust was such a, momentous event, and so traumatic to many families. And so, I just feel, my father's story was obviously very interesting to me. And I think that his background and his experiences were, something that I think other people might relate to, fleeing from a despotic leader and losing his own father, and just my process of uncovering this world that he had left behind. I think it's, I think it's interesting, and I don't know. I hope other people will find it that way as well.
Well, we're going to find out, because we're going to have you back in December, and you'll be presenting to the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance group live, and you'll be talking about your book in the presentation. So I'm thrilled that you'll come back, and you'll be published by then in November, and you'll have some real feedback from the audience who has it. So thank you very much, Peter Kupfer, the author of The Glassmaker's Son, to be published by remind me by who the publisher is?
Amsterdam Publishers in the Netherlands.
Okay, and they'll be publishing it in November. So thanks for being part of the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance group on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you. And thank you to the audience for being with us.
Thank you.